For 4 years, the FBI told America there were only 2 ways a 5-year-old could vanish from her home in rural Tennessee. They were wrong. And the footprints found nearly a mile away in the woods prove it. What really happened to Summer Wells isn't what you've been told. It's darker, more calculated, and it involves a corridor of secrets stretching 9.5 miles through the Appalachian foothills. This isn't just another missing child case. This is a story about evidence that doesn't add up, timelines that keep changing, and a family connection that law enforcement tried to bury until federal agents showed up with shovels. If you want the truth, the kind of truth that makes your skin crawl and your blood run cold, then you need to subscribe to the Case Files Collective right now. Hit that bell icon because what we're about to uncover will change everything you thought you knew about this case. June 15, 2021. Beech Creek, Tennessee. The kind of Tuesday that sits heavy on your chest, humid and thick, the air so still you can hear the cicadas screaming from miles away. Summer Moon Utah Wells, just 5 years old, blonde hair, bright eyes, was at her home on 110, Ben Hill Road. It's a remote stretch of asphalt that winds up into the ridges, the kind of place where neighbors are far apart and help takes time to arrive. By 6:30 that evening, Summer's mother, Candace Bly, dialed 911. Her daughter was gone. Just gone. No scream, no struggle, no witnesses. One moment Summer was there, and the next she had vanished into thin air like smoke dissolving into the Tennessee dusk. The response was immediate and overwhelming. FBI agents, Tennessee Bureau of Investigation officers, helicopters slicing through the sky, search and rescue teams, volunteers flooding in from surrounding counties. They deployed tracking dogs, the kind trained to follow humans sent through the thickest terrain. And those dogs picked up something. They followed Summer's scent away from the house, downhill, through the dense woods toward Ben Hill Road. The trail was clear, deliberate, moving in one direction. And then, right there at the edge of the road, the scent just stopped. Vanished. Like Summer had been erased from existence. When a scent trail ends abruptly like that, investigators know what it means. Vehicular transfer. Someone put Summer into a car, a truck, something with wheels, and drove away. The dogs couldn't follow anymore because there was nothing left to follow. No footprints on asphalt. No scent in the wind. Just emptiness. For days, search teams combed ravines, creeks, abandoned barns, every inch of those unforgiving Appalachian woods. They found nothing. Not a shoe. Not a piece of clothing. Not a single trace of the little girl who disappeared in broad daylight. When a child goes missing, the timeline is everything. It tells investigators where to search, who had access, and what kind of disappearance they're dealing with. But in Summer Wells' case, there was no solid timeline. There were 3 different versions of the same story, and none of them matched. Candace Bly gave her first account the day after Summer disappeared. She told a local news station that she had gone inside the house briefly, just for a few minutes, and when she came back outside, Summer was gone. Simple. Direct. Summer was playing outside, Candace stepped away, and her daughter vanished. But then the story changed. In later interviews, Candace described something completely different. She said Summer had come back inside the house, that she had walked her down into the basement to play with her toys, and that she had briefly helped Summer's grandmother, who was also at the house that day. When Candace went back to check on Summer, the basement door was open and Summer was gone. This version placed Summer's last known location inside the residence, not outside near the yard. And then there was a third version. According to Hawkins County Sheriff Ronnie Lawson, Summer's 3 older brothers told investigators they saw their little sister walk out the back door on her own. Not that she was in the basement. Not that she was outside playing. They said they watched her leave through the back door, deliberately, on her own 2 feet. So which is it? Was Summer last seen outside in the yard? Was she last seen in the basement? Or was she last seen walking out the back door? These aren't small details. These are foundational pieces of information that determine the entire direction of an investigation. And the fact that the people who were there that day couldn't agree on something so basic sent up immediate red flags. Memory under trauma can be fragmented. Stress does strange things to the brain, and when something as horrific as a child's disappearance happens, it's understandable that details might blur. But fragmentation creates gaps. It doesn't rewrite entire scenes. It doesn't move a child from one location to another depending on who's asking the questions. When caregivers provide conflicting accounts of a child's last moments, investigators don't just take notes and move on. They start asking why. Why does the story keep changing? Why can't the people who were supposed to be watching her agree on where she was? And why has law enforcement never publicly addressed these contradictions? For days after Summer Wells disappeared, the investigation took a turn that nobody saw coming. It was June 19, 2021, and tracking dogs were still working the area around Ben Hill Road, following scent trails, searching for any indication of where Summer might have gone. And then they found something that changed everything. Footprints. Not on the Wells property. Not in the immediate area around the house. But on two neighboring properties located off Fields Road, nearly a mile away from where Summer was last seen. One property belonged to a man named Mr. Phillips. The other belonged to a woman named Mary Sexton. The discovery was significant enough that law enforcement immediately mobilized additional resources. They expanded the search perimeter. They brought in more personnel. They deployed drones and canine units to comb every inch of the surrounding terrain. But here's what they didn't do. They didn't tell the public which direction those footprints were going. They didn't confirm whether the prints matched Summer's shoe size. They didn't clarify whether it was a continuous trail through the woods or just isolated impressions scattered across the properties. They didn't explain whether the prints were found in dense forest or along a cleared path. And to this day, more than 4 years later, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation has never publicly addressed those footprints in any meaningful detail. Why does that matter? Because footprints are not ambiguous evidence. They either lead somewhere or they don't. They either match the timeline or they don't. They either support the theory that Summer wandered off or they completely contradict it. The fact that law enforcement took immediate action, expanded the search, and brought in additional teams tells us one thing. Those footprints were relevant. But the silence that followed tells us something else. They didn't fit the narrative. If Summer wandered off on her own, you would expect to find footprints near the house, maybe down a trail, maybe toward a creek or a clearing where a curious child might explore. But you wouldn't expect to find them nearly a mile away on someone else's land. Wandering doesn't follow a straight line. It's chaotic. Random. A lost child moves in circles. They backtrack. They get disoriented. They don't travel in a single direction through dense Appalachian forest and end up on a neighbor's property. That's not wandering. That's being led. When you start mapping out the locations in the Summer Wells case, something becomes impossible to ignore. These aren't random points scattered across Hawkins County. They form a pattern. A pathway. A corridor that runs in one specific direction, and that direction tells a story law enforcement has never been willing to speak out loud. Let's start with the origin point. Ben Hill Road, 110, Ben Hill Road to be exact. That's where Summer was last reported to be on June 15, 2021. That's where the tracking dogs picked up her scent and followed it downhill toward the road before it vanished completely. That's where this entire nightmare began. Now move to the second point. Fields Road. That's where the footprints were discovered 4 days later, nearly a mile from the Wells home. The properties belonging to Mr. Phillips and Mary Sexton sit in dense wooded terrain, the kind of landscape where someone could move without being seen, especially if they knew the area well. Fields Road isn't just a random location. It's a transitional point. It's where the woods meet the road system. It's where someone on foot could meet someone in a vehicle. It's where a transfer could happen quietly, quickly, without witnesses. And then there's the third point. Van Hill Road. On November 13, 2024, more than 4 years after Summer disappeared, FBI agents executed a search warrant at 3500 Van Hill Road. This is a 27-acre property owned by an elderly man named Paul Hill. And here's the critical detail. Van Hill Road is 9.5 miles from Ben Hill Road. That's not wandering distance. That's not even close. A 5-year-old child doesn't cover that kind of ground on foot, not through Appalachian terrain, not without water, not without help. So if the FBI is searching that property, it's because they have reason to believe Summer or evidence related to Summer ended up there. And that means someone moved her. Deliberately. With intent. Along a specific route. When you plot Ben Hill Road, Fields Road, and Van Hill Road on a map, they don't scatter randomly across the county. They align. They fall along the same directional axis, southeast, away from the Wells home, through wooded corridors, toward a broader road network that connects the entire region. It's not coincidence. It's convergence. And convergence is what investigators look for when they're mapping movement in a criminal investigation. On June 15, 2021, the day Summer Wells disappeared, there was something else happening in the area around Ben Hill Road. Something that most people overlooked. Something that provided perfect cover for someone who needed to move through the neighborhood without raising suspicion. Tree trimming crews were working in the area. These weren't just random workers passing through. They were contracted crews clearing branches away from power lines, a routine job in rural areas where vegetation can interfere with electrical infrastructure. They had trucks. They had equipment. They had ladders and toolboxes. And most importantly, they had a legitimate reason to be there. Nobody questions a tree trimming crew. They're part of the landscape. They're expected. They blend in. Now here's where it gets interesting. Paul Hill, the elderly man who owns the property on Van Hill Road that the FBI just searched, has a son who owns a tree trimming business. Does that mean his company was working on Ben Hill Road that day? We don't have confirmation of that. But the overlap is impossible to ignore. You have tree trimmers working near the Wells home on the day Summer disappeared. You have a family member of a Ben Hill Road resident who owns a tree service. And you have a property connected to that same family being searched by federal agents 4 years later. Let me tell you why tree trimming crews matter in a case like this. They have mobility. They move from property to property throughout the day. They travel rural roads that most people never use. They have vehicles that match the general description law enforcement was looking for. Remember the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's announcement about a red or maroon Toyota Tacoma with a ladder rack spotted in the Beach Creek area on June 14 or 15? Tree trimming crews often drive trucks exactly like that. Open beds. Ladder racks. Toolboxes mounted on the sides. They're designed to carry equipment, but they could also carry other things. And nobody would notice. Tree trimmers also have geographic knowledge. They know which roads connect. They know which areas are accessible by vehicle and which require walking. They know where they can park without drawing attention. They understand the terrain because they work in it every single day. Their presence doesn't raise alarms. A tree trimming truck parked on the side of a rural road? Normal. Workers walking through wooded areas near homes? Expected. In missing child investigations, geography matters. But relational geography matters even more. It's not just about where things happened. It's about who connects those places. And in the Summer Wells case, one family name keeps appearing in locations that can't be ignored. Fred Hill lived on Ben Hill Road at the time Summer disappeared. He wasn't a suspect. He wasn't a witness of record. Law enforcement never publicly named him as relevant to the case. But from the very beginning, Fred inserted himself into the narrative. He gave interviews to local media. He made statements about what he saw and when he saw it. He offered timelines and descriptions. And almost every single one of them contained contradictions. Fred claimed to have seen people on Ben Hill Road at specific times on June 15. But when investigators tracked down those people, they had alibis. Verified alibis. Employer records. Security footage. Timestamps that proved they weren't where Fred said they were. He described movements that didn't match the known facts. He referenced events that couldn't be corroborated. And yet, he kept talking. He kept inserting himself into a story that didn't need him. Now, does that make Fred guilty of something? Not necessarily. But it makes him unreliable. And in an investigation, unreliable informants are dangerous. Not because they're necessarily lying, though some do, but because they create noise. They distort the timeline. They send investigators down dead ends. They muddy water that's already murky. And in a case like this, where every detail matters, Fred Hill's statements didn't help. They made things worse. But here's the thing about unreliable narrators. Even when they're wrong, they reveal patterns. They talk about the places they know. The people they're familiar with. The roads they travel. And if you pay close enough attention, those patterns start to form a map. A map of associations. A map of proximity. A map that might just lead somewhere no one expected. Fred Hill lived on Ben Hill Road. His relative, Paul Hill, owns a 27-acre wooded property on Van Hill Road. And on November 13, 2024, federal agents descended on that property with a search warrant and shovels. This isn't just about owning land. It's about connection. It's about access. It's about family ties that link the origin point where Summer disappeared to the destination point where the FBI believes something happened. In missing child cases, investigators pay close attention to how families respond. Not just what they say, but how they say it. The language they use. The emotions they display. The actions they take. Because behavior reveals belief. And in the case of Dawn Wells and Candace Bly, their behavior has been telling a story that doesn't match the official narrative of stranger abduction or a child who wandered off. Dawn Wells has spoken publicly multiple times since Summer disappeared. And almost every time he opens his mouth, he uses the language of death. Not possibility. Not fear. Not hope. Death. He describes dreams where Summer appears in a perfect, heaven-like environment. He talks about burial. He references her being gone in a way that suggests finality, not uncertainty. And when asked to plead for Summer's return, to beg whoever took her to bring her back, Dawn refused. He said he was done pleading. That he wasn't going to do it anymore. Think about that for a second. If your child was missing, if you believed there was even the smallest chance they were alive, would you stop pleading? Would you stop asking for help? Would you stop begging whoever took them to have mercy and return them? Or would you do it every single day until you had answers? Dawn's refusal to plead is what behavioral analysts call distancing language. It's a psychological signal that indicates emotional separation from the subject. It suggests the speaker has already accepted an outcome. And in missing child cases, that kind of acceptance, especially early on, is a red flag. Because parents who genuinely believe their child is alive don't give up. They don't stop fighting. They don't normalize death in their public statements. They hold on to hope like it's the only thing keeping them breathing. Candace Bly's behavior is different, but equally problematic. Her narrative has shifted multiple times. Her recall is fragmented. And when pressed on specific details, she shuts down. She becomes avoidant. She withdraws. During an appearance on Dr. Phil, when questioned about certain aspects of the timeline, Candace deflected. She changed the subject. She refused to engage with questions that should have been easy to answer. Avoidance isn't proof of guilt. But it is proof of discomfort. And the question investigators have to ask is, what is she uncomfortable about? Is it the trauma of losing her daughter? Or is it the fear of saying something that contradicts an earlier statement? In the days following Summer's disappearance, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation issued a public announcement that caught everyone's attention. They were looking for a specific vehicle. A red or maroon Toyota Tacoma with a full bed ladder rack that had been spotted in the Beach Creek community on June 14 or 15, right around the time Summer vanished. This wasn't a casual mention. This was a direct appeal to the public. Law enforcement wanted to know who owned that truck. They wanted to know where it had been. They wanted to talk to the driver. The description was specific enough to matter but vague enough to cast a wide net. Red or maroon. Toyota Tacoma. Ladder rack. That's the kind of truck you see all over rural Tennessee. Contractors use them. Landscapers use them. And tree service companies use them. Here's what makes this vehicle so important. A Toyota Tacoma with a ladder rack isn't just a work truck. It's a mobile concealment device. The bed can carry equipment, tools, tarps, anything you need for a job. And if someone needed to transport something, or someone, without drawing attention, a truck like that would be perfect. It's functional. It's common. It blends in. Nobody gives it a second look. But here's the problem. After that initial announcement, the red Toyota Tacoma disappeared from the narrative. The TBI never followed up publicly. They never said they found it. They never said they ruled it out. They just stopped talking about it. And that silence is deafening because if they had found the truck and cleared the driver, they would have said so. If it turned out to be irrelevant, they would have moved on publicly. But they didn't. Which means one of two things. Either they never found it, or they found it and it led somewhere they didn't want to discuss. Now let's connect this back to what we already know. Tree trimming crews were working in the area on June 15. Paul Hill's son owns a tree service business. Tree service companies use trucks with ladder racks. And Paul Hill owns the property on Van Hill Road that the FBI just searched with shovels and federal agents. Is it possible that the red Toyota Tacoma law enforcement was looking for belongs to someone connected to the tree trimming operation? Is it possible that truck was seen in the area because it had a legitimate reason to be there, and that's exactly what made it invisible? For 4 years, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation maintained the same public position. Summer Wells either wandered off into the dense Appalachian wilderness surrounding her home, or she was abducted by an unknown stranger. Those were the only two theories they would discuss. Those were the only two scenarios they presented to the public. And for 4 years, that narrative held, until November 13, 2024, when everything changed. On that cold autumn morning, federal agents descended on a remote property in Greenville, Tennessee. FBI. TBI. Hawkins County Sheriff's Office. All moving with coordinated precision. The location was 3500 Van Hill Road, a 27-acre stretch of wooded land owned by Paul Hill. And the agents didn't come empty-handed. They brought shovels. They brought excavation equipment. They brought cadaver dogs. This wasn't a casual follow-up visit. This was a full-scale search operation. The presence of the FBI at this location shattered the official narrative in one decisive moment. Because Van Hill Road is 9.5 miles from Ben Hill Road. That's not wandering distance. A 5-year-old child doesn't walk 9.5 miles through rugged mountain terrain. Not without water. Not without food. Not without someone noticing. So if Summer didn't wander there, and the official theory says she was taken by a random stranger, then why would federal agents spend resources searching a property that requires deliberate transportation to reach? The answer is simple. Law enforcement knows something they're not saying. They know Summer didn't wander off. They know this wasn't a random stranger abduction. They know someone moved her from Ben Hill Road to or near Van Hill Road. And they know that movement required planning, local knowledge, and a vehicle. The search at Van Hill Road wasn't about following old leads. It was about following evidence that pointed to a specific location connected to specific people. The property itself is significant. It's isolated. It's heavily wooded. It's the kind of place where you could hide almost anything and no one would know. The kind of place where someone familiar with the land could move freely without being seen. The kind of place that becomes very interesting when you realize it's owned by a relative of someone who lived on the same road where Summer disappeared. For 4 years, law enforcement told the public there were only 2 possible explanations. On November 13, 2024, their actions proved there was always a third. The evidence doesn't lie. It never does. You can ignore it. You can bury it. You can refuse to acknowledge it publicly. But you can't make it disappear. And in the Summer Wells case, every single piece of evidence, every geographic marker, every investigative action, points in the same direction. Not toward a child who wandered off. Not toward a random stranger who happened to be driving through a remote area at exactly the right time. But toward something far more calculated. Far more deliberate. Far more terrifying. Let's put it all together. Summer's scent trail led away from the house downhill toward Ben Hill Road and stopped abruptly at the roadway. That's vehicular transfer. Someone put her in a vehicle. 4 days later, footprints were found on properties off Fields Road, nearly a mile from the Wells home. Law enforcement expanded the search immediately but never clarified the details. That's directional movement through wooded terrain toward a road network. And then, more than 4 years later, the FBI executes a search warrant at a property on Van Hill Road, 9.5 miles away, owned by a relative of someone who lived on Ben Hill Road. That's the destination. Origin. Pathway. Destination. The equation is complete. Ben Hill Road to Fields Road to Van Hill Road. All 3 locations fall along the same southeast corridor through dense Appalachian terrain. This isn't random. This isn't coincidence. This is a map. A map of movement. A map that someone with local knowledge, someone with access, someone with a vehicle and a reason could have followed without being detected. Tree trimming crews were working in the area on the day Summer disappeared. Paul Hill's son owns a tree service. Fred Hill lived on Ben Hill Road and gave contradictory statements. Paul Hill owns the property on Van Hill Road that federal agents just searched. The family connections link every critical location in this case. The geographic corridor connects them physically. And the evidence, the footprints, the scent trail, the FBI raid, confirms that Summer Wells didn't vanish into thin air. She was moved. For 4 years, the TBI insisted there were only 2 possibilities. But their own actions on November 13, 2024, proved they knew the truth all along. Someone took Summer. Someone who knew the area. Someone who had the means. Someone who had the motive. And someone who thought they could hide her along a corridor of secrets that stretched 9.5 miles through the Tennessee foothills. If you made it this far, if you followed every piece of evidence, every contradiction, every connection, then you know this case is far from over. Subscribe to the Case Files Collective right now. Turn on those notifications. Because we're not done digging. We're not done asking questions. And we're not done demanding answers. Summer Wells deserves the truth. And we're going to make sure she gets it. Share this video. Comment below with your theories. Let's keep Summer's story alive until justice is served.